Chapter 17, Humanistic Psychology, The Future of Humanistic Psychology by Jennifer Tellez, University of the Incarnate Word. I will be discussing humanistic psychology, its beginning, and what the future holds for it. What is humanistic psychology? To define humanistic psychology, we have to dissect the word, and we basically get humanism. So what is humanism? Humanism gives value to the life of a person through reason and 5 phases of self. Phase 1 is self-reflection, in which a person gives careful consideration to their character in relation to the world around them. After you have given thought to your character, comes Phase 2, which is self-realization, and a person becomes aware of themselves. Next is Phase 3, self-actualization, and a person becomes aware of their full potential. Phase 4 is self-transcendence, and a person maximizes their full potential to overcome limits above their normal physical and mental level. And once you obtain Phase 1 through 4, then Phase 5 is achieved, which is self-fulfillment, and a person can find contentment or gratification as an outcome of a growing character. Therefore, the definition of humanistic psychology is the study of a person as a whole. We cannot have a future without having a past, so we start with the beginning of humanistic psychology by taking a look at Renaissance humanism and the shift from theology to the science of human nature. We first catch a glimpse of Renaissance humanism with a rebirth or revival of Roman and Greek philosophy, arts, and literature through the works of an Italian poet, scholar, and moralist, Francesco Petrarch. He was considered an early leader in Renaissance humanism. He emphasized the importance of practical solutions to life's problems, and as living beings of this earth, we should be encouraged by the very nature of everything around us to live and be present in the moment. Next is Italian Niccolò Machiavelli, and his focus was on the impact of social influences on human life and behavior. He was the founder of modern political science and social psychology. Followed by Spaniard Juan Luis Vives, who has been called by some the founder of modern psychology. He gravitated and used empirical studies on human emotion and memory and their relation to environmental and social influences. He was ahead of his time in that he also supported the education of women and the poor to enhance social reform. Another emergence from Italy was Leonardo da Vinci, whose contributions were in the arts and expanded human knowledge by his anatomical illustrations and perception of human emotion through senses. Then we have Paracelsus, who graciously went by his nickname. He was a physician, alchemist, astrologer, and scientist from Switzerland. He believed humans gained happiness by being in sync with nature, and to fall out of sync would cause unhappiness. Frenchman Michel de Montaigne follows, as he was skeptical about authentic knowledge from prior Greek and Roman works. When Montaigne was not being skeptical, his focus was on thought, emotion, and motivation. He condemned physical punishment on children because it makes them slow to learn, but instead children should find delight in learning. Montaigne examined human experience to be impure and human actions to be inconsistent. The only female to emerge was Spaniard Olivia Sabuco. However, her works are debated and questioned due to the authorship conflict with her father, Miguel Sabuco. Olivia still received full credit, and her work survived the Spanish Inquisition. Her psychological contribution deals with the passion of humans, for example, Consequences that arise out of jealousy or hatred can lead to physical illness or death, and the polar opposite are the consequences of happiness and love, which are better physical health and longevity of life. Interestingly enough, Olivia found the interlocking between physiological and psychological nature of humans. At the tail end of the Renaissance, a Spaniard physician by the name of Juan Huarte came into view and presented his ideas in educational psychology, physiology, and psychiatry in a book called The Examination of Men's Wits. Huarte emphasized the importance of early childhood development because every child has a different nature of learning that helps for future placement. Throughout his knowledge as a physician, he correlated humoral temperature to an individual's personalities and differences. Humanistic Reformation was the increase of awareness by humanists in the School of Psychology. During this era, Reformation leaders began to notice reform was needed for human rights, especially in the areas of equality for women, safer working conditions, and better treatment of children, the mentally ill, or incarcerated. There was also a call for animal rights and the humane treatment of animals, along with proper nourishment and housing for the animals. There are many leaders of the humanitarian reform. Philip Pinel was the first to reform asylums due to the poor living conditions that caused people to suffer in filth and less than ample space. His ways of thinking and his ideas gave some insight of what was to come for the new age of humanistic psychology. Another leader happens to be an American founding father, Benjamin Rush, who took the same stance as Pinel when it came to reform. Rush spoke out against the inhumane treatment of prisoners, corporal punishment, and capital punishment. Some of his studies were on mental and personality disorders. Others that followed suit of humane treatment of individuals with mental disorders in asylums or prisons were William Turk, his great-grandson Daniel Hack Turk, Vincenzo Chiraghi, and Johann Christian. Other forms of reform began to break through, and the first was social reform, which gained recognition by an American named Dorothea Dix. She was a stern, well-educated, and accomplished teacher for young girls and for the poor. Her interests changed drastically after a visit to a jail in which she was appalled by the filthy conditions and the cohabitation of criminals, mentally ill, and the cognitively disabled. She studied the Turks and Pinel's works and set out to make changes, and changes she made. Dix traveled to jails throughout America, did research, collected data, and found that they were all similar and inhumane. Her vast work in reform helped establish better mental hospital conditions, new schools for the feeble-minded, and training for nurses. She wrote memorials for politicians, and they were focused on individuals being cured. After Dix's involvement in the Civil War, the gusto she once had dwindled along with her funding. As time passed after her death, and with the lack of funds, care for the mentally ill and cognitively disabled fell by the wayside in America. Cognitive disabilities reform was also making headway in France. A physician, Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, cared for a boy that was essentially a feral child and proved that individuals with cognitive disabilities can be taught language and useful skills. Edouard Seguin was also a Frenchman that enlisted in an approach that assisted and taught people with cognitive disorders sensory and self-management skills. Women's reform was elicited due to the fact that women were discriminated against and treated unfairly regardless of their abilities. Women's reform began with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. that headed the battle of women's suffrage. Margaret Sanger stepped up to fight for the reform of women's rights and through controversial ways to manage their bodies, health, and family size through the use of birth control. Sanger noticed that poor women were opting for botched abortions and dying from the procedure. She created several organizations which eventually became Planned Parenthood, and it is still a topic of controversy today. The main areas of observance in psychology had been behavioral and psychoanalysis due to their testable theories and scientific nature of measurement. Behaviorists and psychoanalysts basically denied humanistic psychology and did not believe there was any empirical support. Humanistic psychology, also known as the third force, was awakened and aimed to test the experiences that evoke behaviors both physically and mentally. A very vocal advocate and forerunner for humanistic psychology was William James. He brought to light his psychological and philosophical view in regards to the third force. He believed that it was important to study experience, and to leave experience out of the equation would draw flaws in the studies. He set out to make changes to the problems that arise in education and life in general, in hopes of a better quality. Part of humanistic psychology is existentialism and the need for better quality of life, and philosopher Miguel Unamuno voiced that it was negligent and an injustice was committed to science when human life and emotional problems were not examined. Unamuno was adamant that humans experienced life and emotions through the whole mind, body, and soul. He also believed that people should be accountable for personal, emotional, and intellectual honesty. Even though Miguel de Unamuno is featured as a believer in existentialism, Soren Kierkegaard is actually known as the founder. Many may also know him as the Danish Socrates. His background in theology was shaded by his father, but it did not hinder him from using theology as an influence for his philosophical view. Kierkegaard became embattled with the Danish church for not adopting Jesus' righteous acts of humanity. There are three modes he introduced, which are aesthetic mode of existence, which dealt with pleasures, ethical mode of existence dealt with moral evaluation, and religious modes of existence that are faith-based. He published 6 books, which were ridiculed at the time of his life, and it is after his death that his work was made a great impact on areas such as philosophy, literature, and psychology. Franz Bernato was influential in his use of scientific procedures and made adaptations to them. His applications and studies of the inner processes, genetics, and comparative studies brought out the importance that psychology needed to become proactive in the unity of consciousness and experience to the relation of human life. A German philosopher and student of Bernato, Edmund Husserl, was the founder of phenomenology, which is a study of consciousness as it relates to objects and the very nature of being. He believed that humans gain knowledge by becoming consciously aware, and gave an individual knowledge not only of the self but of the world. Husserl's phenomenology was not without implications, and his disciplined naivete drew questions among the psychological community. The 1960s made great advancements for humanistic psychology, or the third force, by the means of existentialism, and a significant contributor that followed in the footsteps of Unamuno and Kierkegaard was Martin Heidegger. and he admired Franz Bernato. Although he was not able to study with Bernato, he was able to study with Bernato's student Husserl. Heidegger's affiliation to the Nazi Party took a toll on his professional career, and his work was questioned. Therefore, he had to redeem himself. He had three hallmarks to his state of being there, or in German, Dasein, which were: factuality was to be in the world, existentiality was to work with time, and fallenness was to be adrift in your life and activities. His perspective was basically not to be wasteful or anxious about life, but to find courage and make life meaningful, because the reality is life ends in death. Gordon Allport was a chief builder in the study of personality and was renowned for originating humanistic psychology. He believed people and their personalities should not be restricted. Allport held a view that psychology gets lost in science, therefore losing focus on the person and all that encompasses them. He emphasized the need to examine prejudice in the legal system, and the studies became part of psychological research. Allport's interest stemmed from motivation and his understanding of motivation to be part of growth of personality. Carl Rogers founded person-centered therapy, which was world-acclaimed, novel, and extreme. Rogers coupled psychotherapy with experimental psychology through listening, observing, and assessing the client. He was concerned with how clients evaluated themselves and others and their environment. His person-centered approach overflowed into the area of teaching and politics. Rogers believed that through his approach there would be trust and freedom to explore the self and give the individual the potential for growth. Abraham Maslow was drawn to a holistic psychological approach and felt that behaviorism and psychoanalysis were too narrow with their approaches. So he put together a problem-centered approach based on hierarchy needs as they pertain to motivation. The lowest level need is the biological need of hunger, which includes thirst or sleep. The need for safety follows. Next is to fulfill psychological needs such as love, then esteem or recognition, and last is self-actualization of the realization of potential. Viktor Frankl was a Nazi Holocaust survivor who was in search for the reason of existence and originated logotherapy. Frankl's belief was that even though overbearing burdens in the life of people, they have a choice to perceive the situation as healthy or unhealthy, and regardless, they will find meaning. He came to the conclusion that if all situations were the same, the perspective of the situation would be different and produce different meanings. There was great debate among Frankl and other well-known humanistic psychology leaders, but Frankl is considered one of the contemporaries to have provided his wisdom and experience as a great contribution to psychology. Another psychologist that believed behaviorism to be narrow was Joseph Reichlach. Reichlach determined that humans are multifaceted creatures and not mechanical. He did not believe psychologists had to change their procedures to fit into the scientific community, because just like science, psychology has its fair share of unknowns. It is due to the disagreements within science, behaviorists, and psychoanalysts that humanistic psychology lost its footing. But before its decline, it propelled and made a stand. Humanistic psychology was a push force against the established Freudian psychology and its deterministic and psychoanalytic ways. It also pushed against the mechanistic approaches of behaviorism. The year of emergence in America for humanistic psychology, as previously mentioned, was 1960. Carl Rogers was the first American Psychological Association president and a major impact on psychology with his client-centered approach. He was succeeded by Abraham Maslow, known as the architect of humanistic psychology, and his hierarchy of needs. An existentialistic view was brought to America from Europe by Rollo May, which was categorized with humanistic psychology. The pinnacle year for humanistic psychology and its innovative ideas was in the 1970s. There was a bandwagon effect amongst the American culture to adopting humanistic ideas as a way for personal growth. Humanistic psychology, its viability and descent was to the point of extinction over the course of 30 years. The questions and the reasons are not without speculation. There are some that believe humanistic psychology imploded, and some believe that it was destroyed by outside destructive forces. The implosion belief stems from the inherent need for people to think and focus on being compliant to the self in order for inner and outer growth. This type of belief would be a downfall for humanistic psychology because of the high potential for self-blame. The ones that believe there were other forces at work to destroy humanistic psychology feel that encounter groups such as sensitivity training, personal growth, and interpersonal groups put forth fatalistic stereotyping. Stereotypes were derived because some encounter groups infringed on personal space and drew controversy, and an example was a practice called naked marathons. Because of these groups, the ethics and scientific nature of humanistic psychology were questioned by many in the realms of education, politics, and religion. One must keep in mind that with all controversy there can be fabrications, so regardless of either belief, humanistic psychology has been a viable force in psychology. The psychological community now questions, is there a future for humanistic psychology? And the answer is yes. There has been a re-emergence of humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology's importance in the 21st century has been gaining momentum, such as cultural psychology and transpersonal psychology, to name a few. Aspects of phenomenology and existentialism have been associated to the field of biopsychology. The relevance of humanistic psychology and its empirical scientific studies are still brought up for mainstream psychology, but humanistic psychology stands firm as a relevant domain. Scientific methods follow quantitative methods and are difficult to define in particular schools of humanistic psychology, namely in the school of transpersonal psychology, or what has been termed spiritual psychology or positive psychology. The argument between scientifically positioned psychologists believe that there are no scientific measures for psychology of a spiritual nature, and transpersonal psychologists believe to put its characteristics of spirituality in a box voids the very nature of human beings. Researcher John Davis has examined ways to bring natural science and human science to a complementary meeting between quantitative and qualitative methods. Davis states that each method has value depending on the situation, and often a combination of methods is best. Quantitative methods give depth and understanding, while qualitative methods focus on the aesthetics of a person's life. The origination of psychology made its way from Europe and other regions abroad through its philosophical views to America in the late 1800s. Psychologist Eric Craig traveled to Seoul, South Korea, and found an unknown approach to the West that would bring added depth to humanistic psychology named Tao psychology. Tao psychology is based on Taoism and the philosophy of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu, which focuses on religious devotion and humbleness. The teaching of Tao psychology is to be mindful of freeing the mind in order to gain enlightenment. This therapeutic approach is client-centered and uses 10 ancient allegories of the ox herder. The story of the ox herder is as follows. Number 1, an individual seeks their existence. Number 2, individuals discover their existence. Number 3, they perceive their existence. Number 4, they learn self-discipline through struggle. Number 5, discipline can be reduced as there is less struggle. Number 6, joy is found. Number 7, struggle is absent and discipline is unused. Number 8, individuals reach transcendence and the mind is free. Number 9, individuals understand the state of being. And number 10, the enlightenment stage of a pure mind is achieved. The Western ways of humanistic psychology have struggled, but with the humanistic psychological thought of the century, which is mindfulness, it will refill the cracks of its foundation. Mindfulness has reemerged, the inner awareness and interconnectedness, consciousness to experience to bring meaning and growth for human capacity. The humanistic psychological paradigm has shifted from the connectedness and growth as a group of people to a holistic approach of growth from within that will emanate out to then reach to the group. Humanistic psychology is in need of redemption, and its survival and future depend on its productivity to prove it is scientific, has a stable structure, and is a legitimate force to be reckoned with. Humanistic psychology has transformed and struggled, but has made some progression to remain the third force, and it brings a holistic approach, sets out to find tranquility and understanding in the ever-growing chaos of the world.